AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with current and former U.S. intelligence officers. And today I am delighted to invite back a friend and former colleague, David Robarge. David has his PhD in American history from Columbia University. He taught at Columbia and worked for David Rockefeller, and then joined the CIA in 1989 as a leadership and political analyst for the Middle East. In 1996, he joined the CIA history staff, and in 2005, he became the chief historian. Over the years, David has written a whole series of articles and papers and monographs, both classified and unclassified, on a variety of intelligence topics, including a biography of Chief Justice John Marshall, and a more recent book on George C. Marshall and his involvement with intelligence during World War II, on which we did a previous AFIO Now interview. David was one of our featured speakers at our February lunch. As you'll recall, this is our 50th anniversary year, and we had asked David to do a history of the last 50 years of intelligence for our audience. He did such a great job that I've asked him back today to do a video recording so that we can distribute this great history to a larger audience. David, welcome back to AFIO Now.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's quite a challenge to compress 50 years of significant intelligence history into a short presentation, and anyone who attempts that will certainly come up with their own list of major events, undoubtedly some that I'm not going to talk about, but these are the ones that I think are most impressive when you're considering their impact on the U.S. intelligence community. Let's go back to the 1970s. And this, of course, is around the time when AFIO was founded, 1975. But it came out of a particular political environment that had changed so starkly from the late 1960s that it helps you explain why David Atlee Phillips resigned from the agency and went on its defense by founding the Association of Retired Intelligence Officers. It was a period of time of almost unbridled hostility to U.S. intelligence, some of it justified, some of it based on exaggeration and misperceptions. I think the fundamental point around that period is the fracturing of the Cold War consensus in which U.S. intelligence had existed since post-World War II period. You had increasing dissent over the Vietnam War. You had exposures of government prevarication through the Pentagon Papers leak. You had, of course, the Watergate scandal, and the whole idea that U.S. foreign policy was a unified exercise mainly designed to contain communism was really now a thing of the past. And it's in that environment that you start having a variety of trends in the popular culture that are feeding into this political transformation. You have much more aggressive investigative journalism. Of course, we think of Woodward and Bernstein and Watergate, but you also have people like Seymour Hersh, Jack Anderson, and others. They become the great paladins of the First Amendment as they're unearthing scandals in the U.S. intelligence community. And this causes some consternation and some angst at the agency, so much so that in 1973, Director of Central Intelligence James Schlesinger ordered agency employees to report anything that they thought was a perceived or actual violation of the CIA charter. And this prompted what came to be known notoriously as the Family Jewels, a collection of reports that the agency officers submitted. It amassed almost 700 pages, though that's somewhat of a myth here. We're not talking about 700 individual acts of illicit or improper activity. We're talking about a big stack of paper that includes the usual bureaucratic paraphernalia of buck slips and DSEM lists and such. It's full of press reports. I looked at every single page of it. And if you get rid of all the chaff, you're down to about 300, 350 pages of interesting stuff. And some of it is concerning. You have evidence of spying on American citizens, of opening American citizens' mail, of drug testing on unwitting subjects. You have investigations of journalists who are trafficking in leaks, a variety of other things. The usual stuff about the mafia came up in it and so forth. It's concerning. And particularly at that stage in American history, it got a lot of people upset. When that material, no surprise, was leaked to the press, then you had a big journalistic splash on the New York Times, December 22, 1974 front page, probably the most damaging single story about the agency and its history. And this prompted some immediate official reaction. You had the Ford administration, which was caught off guard. Bill Colby had told Congress about the jewels, but not the White House for some bizarre reason. And that prompted the Ford administration to convene the Rockefeller Commission, named for Vice President Nelson Rockefeller. Now, if you read the Rockefeller report, it's actually a very good, solid historical document and very candid. It's unclassified, very candid about the things that the agency did. It sets the record straight on some of the misperceptions, and it made some useful recommendations. However, it was perceived at the time as mainly a damage control exercise, a whitewash from the White House, and that prompted Congress to get into the act. And that's when you have the famous Church and Pike Committee hearings. Now, important distinction between the two. The Church Committee, named for Frank Church, who was planning to use the hearings as a springboard for his presidential campaign, still unannounced, sought after sensationalism. He immediately focused on what he called the rogue elephant, CIA, the institution without any oversight, without any controls, that was running around the world doing all sorts of wicked things. And he focuses on things like assassination plots, covert actions that were conceived in a way to get rid of people the agency and the US government didn't like, and so forth. He has a series of public hearings, a lot of closed door hearings as well. And over the course of roughly a year or so, it creates quite a spectacle that really tarnished the agency's image. Now, on the House side, you have a rather different enterprise in the Pike Committee. This one, regrettably, did not come to fruition because of some internal managerial problems and a propensity for leaking that discredited it. But at least it got off to a sensible start by asking some fundamental questions about US intelligence. Were we getting our money's worth? Were the agencies doing their jobs basically correctly? Were they overreaching? Were they spending too much money and so forth? All good, solid questions that the Church Committee was not really answering or even investigating. But the Pike Committee, because it ruined its own reputation, wound up not even having its report officially published. When you go into a bookstore or you buy it online, the Pike Committee report, you're actually dealing with a leaked classified document that was never published in the United States. The original copy was published over in the UK. The upshot of these investigations, though, was a new regime of accountability. One of the Church Committee's recommendations was finally to have standing oversight committees in Congress. Previously, and this is an important point about this breakup of the Cold War consensus, you had 4 committees looking at intelligence activities, the Armed Services and Appropriations Committees of each House. For decades, they were run by friends of CIA, Cold War liberals for the most part, mostly Democrats, very national security conscious, really not interested in oversight. It was probably more like overlook. Do you have enough money? If not, let us know how much more you need, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in the early 1970s, this old guard on Capitol Hill starts to diminish. They're either retiring, they're dying, or they're being voted out. And one of the big changes that occurred because of the Watergate scandal was an influx of new, younger, more aggressive, more liberal, more skeptical members of Congress who became big engines for accountability. And what you have as in 1976 and 77 roll through the establishment of the Senate first and then the House Permanent Oversight Committees. You also had in late 74, early 75, the passage of an amendment called the Hughes-Clark Amendment that called for presidential findings. The president actually had to sign a document specifically authorizing over his own name every covert action or significant intelligence activity. This was all brand new. If you go back and look at documents from the 50s and 60s, and you try to find Eisenhower or Kennedy or Johnson specifically authorizing a covert action, you won't find it. It's all there in the NSC black box. Now that's all over. No more plausible deniability. Congress also starts running more investigations into intelligence activities. It looks very closely at the budget. It starts line item eliminating certain appropriations for particular activities. And then in 1980, you have the passage of the Intelligence Accountability Act, which requires that Congress be fully and currently informed of every major intelligence activity and covert action. Now, what does that general language mean? The president can still decide who in Congress he will allow to be briefed on these major developments. Is it going to be the full committees, committee and staff? Is it just going to be the leadership of the committee and the chambers, the so-called gang of four or gang of eight? It all depends. I mean, most recently, with the strikes in Iran, you have had concerns that the president did not fully and currently inform Congress of what was going on. This is an issue that is a perennial. But it all started back with the results of the 1970s turmoil over intelligence. As we turn into the 1980s, we have a very different picture. Jimmy Carter, who was brought in as an outsider president in 1977 with an agenda pretty much anti-intelligence, he's changed his mind radically because in 1979, some major events occurred. The Somoza regime in Nicaragua falls to the Marxist Sandinistas, and the Soviets invade Afghanistan. And suddenly, Jimmy Carter realizes he needs intelligence, he needs covert action, and he authorizes both the covert actions in Nicaragua and Afghanistan. We associate them with the Reagan administration, but they started under Carter. But the Carter administration was relatively feckless, both internationally in foreign policy terms and in domestic policy, particularly with the economy. And then, of course, the Iran hostage crisis ruins its reputation. So in come two new figures who changed the course of intelligence radically in a remarkably short period of time. I'm speaking of Ronald Reagan, president, and William Casey, DCI. Now, Reagan had a simple answer to the Cold War. We win, they lose. And he launched major intelligence offensives, some of which I can't talk about yet, but some I can. And they were major factors in the burgeoning intelligence budget and staffing of the 1980s. You find now in the White House a complete rejection of the Carter administration's timidity toward using covert action and intelligence. And Reagan sets out to pressure the Soviet Union to collapse. It's a remarkable decade. You have the two programs I've already mentioned succeeding. The Soviets were kicked out of Afghanistan because of major covert action efforts on the part of the US and some allies like Pakistan and China, who were also involved in providing arms to the Mujahideen. Israel was also in there. And you also have the support of the Contras in Nicaragua, which put so much pressure on the Ortega regime in Nicaragua to live up to its promises for liberalism and democracy, which of course communists don't believe in, so no surprise. when the Sandinistas took over, they instituted a repressive government. But along the way, you have the Iran-Contra scandal. And here's something I really hope to clarify for our listeners here. We almost immediately associate the Nicaragua program with Iran-Contra. What we need to emphasize is that was an illegal sideshow by some rogue elements in the National Security Council, Ollie North in particular, John Poindexter as well, and several people at CIA, including the Director of Operations, Claire George, but a handful of other people. And some other individuals were implicated in it as well. Well, this was an illegal operation. The reason why it came about was because, unlike with the Afghan program, which Congress supported wholeheartedly for the most part, the Nicaragua program encountered lots of opposition, and money was regularly turned on and turned off, which is, of course, no way to run an effective covert action. It got so bad by the mid-1980s that individuals in the Reagan administration, and it's still not clear how much the president knew in detail, and even Bill Casey has been thought to have been the mastermind of this, but again, no smoking gun there. And then he died before anybody could really find out. But because of this irregularity in funding, the Reagan administration decided to pull a fast one. Selling arms to Iran was banned since the hostage incident and the Islamic takeover, but the Reagan administration went ahead and did so. And then it would siphon off the profits from those sales to provide covert funding for the Contras. And this is the illegal part of it. Once Congress started funding the Contras regularly in 1986, then the situation in Nicaragua changed significantly, and the paramilitary Contras were able to fight the Sandinistas pretty much to a standstill on the battlefield. So much so that the Sandinistas decide to sue for peace before things get worse. And then they do agree, under pressure, to have a free and open election. To everybody's surprise, they lost, most notably their own, but the intelligence community missed the call as well. The person who was elected president was Violeta Chamorro, the widow of a prominent Contra leader. And the program worked. That was the whole point of the program. Back in 1982 and even before under Carter, get the Sandinistas to live up to their promises. And ultimately, they were forced to do so. That's why I want to emphasize that the Nicaragua covert action was successful, so much so that the system remained free and open for decades. And guess what happened in the early 2010s? Another presidential election rolled around, and who won? Daniel Ortega, the former head of the Sandinistas. And what do you expect happened over the ensuing decade? The same thing that happened in the 1980s: repression, suppression of dissent, corruption, and so forth. But the agency has had no finding to get engaged with Nicaragua again, and so we've just had to let it run its course. An ironic twist to an successful covert action. Now, the Reagan administration put a huge amount of pressure on the Soviet Union, which was also in dire straits. Its economy was collapsing. Its political institutions were unstable, a lot of infighting. The head of the government was dying every year or so. And this was a great opportunity for the Reagan administration to put economic, political, and military pressure on the Soviet Union. And certainly the Mujahideen program and the support to the resistance of the Soviet occupation was a major factor. Eventually, 47,000 Soviet casualties, and it led to the disrepute of the Gorbachev regime. Now, Gorbachev himself came in as a reformer, and for a while, things looked pretty good, like he might be able to pull off some significant changes. But of course, he encountered significant resistance and also probably overreached. He ultimately turned out to be someone who wanted to save the Soviet system by reforming it rather than fundamentally changing it. And that eventually did not work. We see as the 1980s rolls through the gradual dissolution of the empire, the satellites start breaking off, portions of the Iron Curtain start getting rolled up, And eventually, as we know, in 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. To everybody's surprise, nobody could have predicted that that would have happened. It was an accident in effective history. Some miscommunication among some border guards in East Berlin suddenly led to those famous scenes of people marching through into West Berlin, sitting on the wall, hacking at it with chisels and picks and things. A great victory, but nobody could necessarily have foreseen that. But I would say that the Reagan administration's pressures on the Soviet Union eventually contributed to, let's say, a little more modestly, its collapse. That, of course, is still being debated among historians, but I think the consensus is pretty much that if Reagan hadn't been there, the Soviet Union would have continued to toil on into the 1990s. Another big change we find in the 1980s is the rise of international terrorism. Now, it had been around, of course, since the 1970s for the most part, mostly Palestinian radicals. But in the 1980s, it really takes off. You have the Lebanon Civil War creating all sorts of instability there. You have the tragic bombing of the U.S. Embassy, in which 8 agency officers were killed. You have the bombing of the Marine barracks, when I think roughly 250 Marines were killed, and so forth. The Abu Nidal organization, one of the most bloody terror organizations ever, has these atrocities committed at the Rome and Vienna airports. The Libyans are behind the bombing of the La Belle Disco in Berlin that prompts a retaliation against him, airstrikes against Libya, which then probably prompts the Pan Am 103 bombing over Lockerbie in 1989. This is now becoming a captivating issue for the U.S. government. And at the CIA, you have the establishment of the Counterterrorist Center in 1986. And that, as we know over the years, has become one of the preoccupations of the agency, particularly after 9/11. The other big event I'd like to highlight in the 1980s was the so-called Year of the Spy, 1985. Actually, it was a little more than a year, late 1984 to early 1986, but the locus of it is in 1985, when 12 Americans are identified as working for foreign powers, mostly the Soviet Union. Now, that's pretty bad. But what we now know is that 3 times that many were not caught. And some of those were some of the worst spies we've ever had. It included Aldrich Ames, Robert Hansen, the Myerses at the State Department, Katrina Leung, the Clyde Lee Conrad ring in NATO, a number of others. It's hard to say what might have happened to U.S. counterintelligence if all 48 of them had been caught all at once. It could have been a devastating blow to our security regime, because we know that the spies are always around. They'll never go away. They're spying on us right now as I'm speaking. Numerous investigations throughout the U.S. government about foreign espionage and Americans who are turning code against us. But counterintelligence is one of those no-win propositions. If you know that people are always going to be spying on you and you're not catching them, then obviously you're not doing your job. If you are catching them, then the question comes up, well, why didn't you find them sooner? How did they get in the door? Didn't you see all the red flags? It's one reason why counterintelligence is a pretty dicey sub-profession to get into, despite its fascinations. But the Year of the Spy prompts significant investigations by both of the oversight committees and some pretty damning condemnations about the disorganization and laxity of U.S. counterintelligence. Now, some of this, I think, is an overreaction to the excesses of James Angleton, and I could go on about that for another hour or two. But the thing I want to emphasize is that when you have a situation in which you're uncovering misdeeds and missteps and shortcomings, you don't want to overreact to it. But I think one of the reasons why the Year of the Spy came about was because people simply stopped doing aggressive counterintelligence, and they simply were allowing these turncoats to not be found because they didn't, in some ways, want to find them, because looking for them would be so disruptive. It would hark back to the notorious Angleton mole hunt. And that's a perennial problem with counterintelligence. And you can see it throughout the period of time I'm talking about, the way the security pendulum goes back and forth, depending on what we find and what we don't find. So at the end of the Cold War, in the 89 to 91 period, we enter a very different epoch in U.S. intelligence history, a Cold War drift. The big enemy is gone. Communist China, though still out there, is not perceived as grave a threat as the Soviet Union. And with that gone, people start to ask questions about how much intelligence do we need? Do we really even need a CIA? Daniel Patrick Moynihan, for example, became one of the big advocates of dispensing with much of U.S. intelligence, specifically with CIA. He was suggesting that we give all the analysts to the State Department, we give all the paramilitary activities and covert influence activities to the Pentagon, and that CIA be just essentially a big MI6, a spy agency that did espionage. And some people even called for its dissolution, almost using the same lines that came out in the mid-1970s. At CIA, major cutbacks in staffing. I think it's been publicly acknowledged that it was about 25% across the board over the years. You have the Soviet analysts being parceled out or retired. In some respects, it was similar to what was happening back in the 70s, post-Vietnam, when you did have a bloated bureaucracy at CIA, and some people should have been dispensed with or certainly reassigned. An additional problem is that the president for most of the 90s was Bill Clinton. And like most Democrats, I'm generalizing here, but most Democrats are more focused on domestic than foreign policy. And this was the case with Clinton. He did not have a foreign policy strategy, probably didn't think he needed one. And as a result, U.S. intelligence is unfocused and does not have a very distinct mission. And the same things that were going on at CIA relative to resources are occurring elsewhere in the intelligence community. Also, Clinton was not terribly interested in intelligence, contrary to, say, Ronald Reagan. He was notorious for having a very chaotic schedule. Presidential briefings often were either delayed or postponed because of what was referred to as Clinton Standard Time, meaning the president's schedule dictated everything. The director for the early part of the 90s, James Woolsey, had very little access to Clinton. You've probably heard the joke about the small plane that crashed on the White House lawn. That was, Woolsey likes to say, me trying to get in to see the president. It was symbolic of that lack of access. And you also have inside the agency a lot of leadership shuffling. It's never a good thing when within a single decade you have 4 different directors. Something's not right. We started out with Bob Gates, who didn't last very long because he was appointed under a Republican administration, George H.W. Bush. So he's replaced by Woolsey. Woolsey winds up getting into a lot of political trouble over several issues. One of them is the Aldrich Ames scandal. Ames is arrested in 1994 after 9 years of spying for the Soviets and Russians. Woolsey is perceived as not handling this properly, not being candid with Congress, slapping wrists rather than chopping off heads, and he winds up being discredited for that. Another issue, which pertains to politicization of analysis, something that's in the news these days again, concerned the country of Haiti. The Clinton administration was very big on Jean-Baptiste Aristide as the democratic leader of the formerly autocratic Haiti. It turns out that Aristide had some kind of psychological problems for which he was taking medication. And this led to the perception, especially on the part of Clinton administration critics in Congress, and mostly Republicans, of course, that the administration was backing the wrong person, that they were having a mentally unstable individual in charge of this country. This became a political hot potato when agency analysis supported the view, with some not very good sourcing, that Aristide was a bit of a mental case. And the director at the time, Woolsey, winds up again being in the crosshairs over this. Then you have him being replaced by John Deutsch. We recently put out a study on the history staff about the Deutsch tenure, which was just roughly about a year, 95, 96, and we call it Hostile Takeover. And it's a good title because that's really what the perception was. Deutsch did not want to be director. He wanted to be Secretary of Defense. He had previously been Deputy Secretary of Defense. But he took the directorship of the agency as a consolation prize. He also insisted on cabinet rank, the first time that had ever happened. And, Casey had it, and then Deutsch insisted on carrying it, having it again. But Deutsch was exceptionally unpopular at the agency, aside from his rather arrogant and aloof personality. And then the group of people he brought in to help him run the agency. This is something an outsider should never do, is bring in a bunch of cronies from the previous job and put them in senior staff positions and give them all sorts of authority to direct the careerists about how to run things. Immediate pushback, it always happens every time that occurs. And as a result, a lot of bad morale, a lot of dissonance, and a lot of disobedience and disrespect for John Deutsch. And it didn't help that the perception was he wanted to turn the agency into a military support organization. And that's what he did by removing from CIA its photographic analysis capabilities and turning them all over to a defense organization, the National Imagery and Mapping Agency, NEMA. This was a tough time for the agency. You had other episodes. You had the crack cocaine scandal, this notion that the agency was trafficking in cocaine in South Los Angeles as a way of getting money for the Contras. That was totally discredited once the press started to look into it after an initial press story about it. But it looked really bad. And when Deutsch went out there in Los Angeles to try to refute the charge, it was an embarrassment. He went to a public meeting, and was booed and heckled and catcalls and all of that. It was quite a spectacle. Then you had the Paris flap, an episode in which we got caught spying on the French. And though they were, of course, spying on us, this didn't look very good. And it created a bit of an imbroglio, a little bit of an international mini scandal. And it prompted a significant change in what the agency was doing. Remember, back here in the 90s, we're starting to talk about economic intelligence more and the possibility of using intelligence as a way of augmenting American competitiveness. Japan is on the rise and so forth. You might recall this is the time when you were hearing stories about the end of the US as a great power and being outcompeted by West Germany and Japan and so forth. So economic intelligence became important. But now, when we're caught spying on the French as an economic competitor, we really weren't interested in its politics or anything like that. We're now taken out of the business. You will not spy on governments for the purpose of collecting economic intelligence that potentially could benefit the U.S. economy. And that became known as the Paris. And then lastly, you have Deutsch leaving under a cloud. And poor guy, he inherited all sorts of problems from the previous directorship. You have the Harold Nicholson spy scandal in 1986, but that started under Woolsey. You have the Paris flap, which had its genesis in earlier years. Problems in Guatemala, in which we were caught using a human rights violator as an asset. So Deutsch institutes what's called the clean hands policy, and that sets off a propensity for risk aversion on the part of the operations directorate. All a very tough time. And then Deutsch himself winds up discrediting himself by taking home his unclassified agency laptop, which happens to have classified information on it. And so he's winds up committing a security violation and eventually has his clearances pulled for a while. And it was a serious misdemeanor. And Bill Clinton on his last day in office, had to pardon Deutsch. Interesting little sidelight here. Those of you who have been at CIA headquarters know that we have a wall of portraits of the director's art gallery, I think it's called. And next time you're there, take a look at Deutsch's painting. He's sitting there at a desk in shirt sleeves, one of the very few directors who wasn't wearing a suit for his portrait. And what you'll notice on the desk behind him is a picture of a satellite. Now, the original painting did not have that picture. The original painting showed a laptop computer on the desk behind him. And after this laptop scandal, another laptop scandal, that was touched up. But if you look closely at the painting, you'll see it's not a really good touch-up job. The paint looks different, the texture is different, but it's just an example of the tough time that Deutsch had, and some of it was self-inflicted. Then he's succeeded by Deputy Director George Tenet. And this is an interesting tenure for a director. My analysis of directors, you can read about it in a Studies in Intelligence article I did back in 2005 when you had the D&I created. And I did a big look back at all the directors up to 2005 and tried to come up with a typology to categorize them by various leadership styles and such. So you had administrators, you had operators, you had reformers, you had restorers, and so forth. Tenet is the only director we've had with a bifurcated career, because from the time he took over from Deutsch in 97 up to 9/11, he was pretty much a technocrat, an administrator who had some ideas. He had a strategic intent program, various things he wanted to do, both inside and outside the agency, a more methodical, managerial type of approach. And then, of course, 9/11 comes around and he switches almost entirely to being an operator, a person who is heavily engaged in operational management and policy toward counterterrorism, which leads us into transition here. We have in the 90s more terrorism. You have the World Trade Center bombing in 93, the Khobar Towers bombing in 96, in which some American servicemen were killed. The two African embassies in Kenya and Tanzania are bombed in 1998 with some fatalities. The USS Cole is attacked in the Persian Gulf in the year 2000. And during this latter 90s period of time, you have an emergence of concern about Islamism as a motivating force in international terrorism. And this becomes symbolized by the establishment of a virtual station outside of CIA headquarters called ALEC Station, named for the son of the first station chief. And this is focused principally on identifying terrorist financing. This is the first time the agency starts to watch Osama bin Laden, who at this time is realized to be a bankroller of Islamist terrorism, which moves us into the 2000s. 9/11 and the counterterrorism wars of the 90s, a huge, huge resource shift at the agency. It effectively becomes a counterterrorism operations and analysis agency. Can't get into the details about it, but I worked in the Counterterrorism Center in the early 90s. And if you look at the early 2000s, you wouldn't recognize it. It's just huge, lots and lots of money. The overall agency budget goes up significantly. And this leads naturally into the big wars of the early 2000s and beyond, Afghanistan and Iraq. The entry into Afghanistan, highly successful in getting rid of the Taliban regime and cracking down on Al Qaeda. Bin Laden is chased out. Opportunities to capture him early on are missed for various reasons, but the agency can take a lot of credit for having those early months of operational success. Gary Schroen and the Jawbreaker team, Gary Bergston and the second wave, working with special forces we got rid of the Taliban in a few months with hardly any casualties. But this leads to a shift in focus to Iraq. And I don't want to get into all the controversies about, was the war a done deal? Did Bush come into office with the idea of vindicating himself and his father in Iraq and so forth? That's all highly controversial, and some of it doesn't have anything to do with intelligence per se, though a couple of controversies certainly arose as a result of that. One of them dealt with the issue of, after we got rid of Saddam in Operation Iraqi Freedom and became an occupying power, which then prompts a lot of internal uprisings and violence against us and our allies there. Was there an insurgency? The I word became very important not to utter at the White House because it would suggest that the whole policy was failing. I would suggest that a huge number of missteps were made at that time, and contrary to some agency advice and analysis that de-Baathification was not a smart move, that we should try other tactics against these anti-U.S. forces and such. Another controversy, a question of policymakers not particularly listening, not particularly interested in hearing what we might have had to say. But as the decade rolls through, we do have operational successes. I can't talk about them in any detail, but the things that we were doing in tandem with special forces pretty much eradicated Al Qaeda in Iraq, especially working with local partners there. Along the way, however, we have the RDI controversy, rendition, detention, and interrogation. Probably the second most damaging press report to come out against the agency was the disclosure of the so-called black sites, the special prisons set up in various countries to interrogate, and in 3 cases to waterboard. And again, all that is grossly exaggerated. Suggest you read Jose Rodriguez's memoir to get the facts straight on that. But that became another huge political scandal. And in tandem with the controversies over our missing the call on Iraq weapons of mass destruction, that leads to some important political shifts. Speaking briefly about Iraq WMD, this is a case in which we were simply not collecting the right information and relying too much on dubious sources, particularly the so-called fabricator, the curveball source that the Germans had. But other issues were involved there too. And I would suggest, if you want to read a fascinating book that tries to explain what exactly was in Saddam's head about WMD, look at Steve Call's recent book, The Achilles Trap, in which he relies on a lot of brand new evidence from Saddam himself, diaries and documentation that were acquired during the occupation. And what this shows is that Saddam was he was doing a real tightrope act here. He was trying to portray himself as a nuclear power when he wasn't. He did so for regional prestige and to keep himself in power. But he could only go so far with that because, as you know, the International Atomic Energy Association, IAEA, had inspectors all over the place. And so he was trying to do a 3-card Monte trick or a shell game or whatever metaphor you want to use, in which he's trying to make it look like he has stuff. And that's why he was obstructing inspections, because he didn't want them to find out that he didn't have anything. But the fact that he's making it look like he does simply reinforces the sanctions regime and the idea that Saddam is a potential international threat, a la Iran these days. And consequently, this is too clever by half, really, what he's trying to do here. But Call's book is great in explaining what was behind it. I think some of the analytic issue here comes back to our propensity to make us think that people think like us. The rational actor fallacy, the mirror imaging fallacy. I mean, that's why we missed Khrushchev putting missiles in Cuba, for example. It made no sense. It was stupid to do. That's why we missed Czechoslovakia invasion in 1968. Brezhnev would never do that. He's a détentenik, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we were having similar issues with Saddam. We just couldn't think that he would pull something like that, pull the wool over our eyes in that fashion. It was one of those alternative analysis scenarios that we never really pursued. And all that in conjunction leads to Tenet's departure in 2004, replacement by Porter Goss from the House Oversight Committee. And he commits the same mistake that Deutsch did and that Turner did. He brings in a bunch of his friends to run the agency, and the careerists pushed back immediately. A number of senior people resigned. It was a mess. But the bigger picture for the intelligence community is the passage of the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act in 2004, and it goes into effect in 2005. This is the Director of National Intelligence, a founding document. It also demotes the DCI to being just the head of the CIA. The Director of Central Intelligence Agency position is statutorily created for the first time. Well, this could be a big relief for the head of the agency because now he doesn't have to worry about running the community anymore. Not that he ever could, because the Defense Department really runs the intelligence community. This DNI creation remains a work in progress. It really has just depended on who is the DNI and what is the DNI's relationship with the president. The most longest serving DNI, Jim Clapper, came from an amazing record of prior intelligence service. While it certainly was the most effective one, but looking back on some of the others, they're significant too. John Negroponte, it probably made sense to put a diplomat in charge right at the start rather than an intelligence professional, just to smooth the troubled waters. He's followed by a couple of military officers, Mike McConnell and Dennis Blair. McConnell's pretty effective, Blair is not. He winds up getting into a useless scrap with the DCIA, Leon Panetta. That's a no-win proposition at the time. Panetta is too well plugged in, too experienced, too highly regarded, access to the White House. Blair thought he could run the community like a battleship, former Navy officer, and that was short-lived. Hence, Clapper comes in and does, I think, a much more effective job. Then the culminating event of that first decade of the new millennium is the takedown of Osama bin Laden. Much talked about in open source. I'm not going to add anything to it here, other than to say this was an extremely tough call on the part of the agency. Because, as you're undoubtedly aware, and I know many of the listeners here have been involved in this process before, it's one thing to kick around an idea inside the walls of Langley, especially saying, we think it's bin Laden, it probably is, I can't think of why it wouldn't be, et cetera, et cetera. It's another thing to take it downtown. And especially with an issue like that, the person who was behind the deaths of nearly 3,000 Americans in 9/11, that's going to force the administration to either act or not act. And can you imagine if we had judged based on relatively limited evidence, but still strong indicators that bin Laden was at Abbottabad, if we had declined to do that, and then he was located there through other means, think of what that would have done as an intelligence failure. That could have been the death knell of CIA, possibly, or whatever, major reorganization, leadership shuffle, who knows. Conversely, if you take that information downtown and you put it in front of the president, it's going to compel him to make a decision to go in or stay out. And can you imagine from the White House's perspective, if they had decided to stay out, and again, bin Laden was located there through other means, what a political failure that would have been, a policy failure. Thankfully, the argument in favor of bin Laden being in Abbottabad was compelling enough. It was by no means certain. It even had some resistance within the community, but the White House went along with it. and authorized the takedown. And again, I won't get into all the details, many of them just from open source. So let's move into the last decade, about which I can't say a huge amount in intelligence terms because so much of it is still classified and some of it is also highly compartmented. But I do think some interesting highlights crop up here. If you look at the current business between Russia and Ukraine, just go back into the 2010s, 2008 for Georgia and 14 for Ukraine, and you'll see clear signposts that Putin was up to his expansionist mentality. He was going to recreate the great Russian Empire in some fashion. It's very clear from even his public writings that he has this in mind. And so it should not be a surprise that he's doggedly pursuing trying to suppress Ukraine's resistance and draw it into his orbit. The Russian influence operations in the 2016 election are very instructive. They've been doing this before in a minor sense. We have indications going all the way back to the Johnson administration of the Russians supporting various candidates, not in a big way, nothing like anything that approached the 2016 affair. But I think it's a signal that the covert influence environment has so radically changed, particularly through social media, that this is now a major battlefield for hearts and minds. One of the problems is the Russians don't have any constraints on what they do. They can do lots of operational techniques that we cannot because of congressional restrictions or other constraints. And as a result, the information war battlefield is really tilted heavily in the Russians' favor. And the Chinese are increasingly getting into the act as well, as you're undoubtedly cognizant of. China's economic growth and its continuing espionage offensive, that again dates back a number of years, nothing new there, but it's far more aggressive. You have lots of public statements from intelligence leaders about their economic espionage, their technology theft, their subversion of institutions, their cracking down on dissidents inside the United States and so forth. Very, very aggressive and undoubtedly going to get even more so, particularly if President Xi over there starts feeling a lot of threat to his own power. One big change at CIA that occurred here was modernization. This was John Brennan's major reorganization of the agency, getting rid of the directorate-focused organization that we had had since the early 1950s under Walter Bedell Smith, and dividing the work of the agency into mission centers that were focused on either geographic or topical subjects. This was highly unpopular in a number of circles at the agency, particularly among the operators who felt that this was a diminution of their authority and influence. And to some extent, they were also concerned for security reasons, because now you had much more collaboration with non-operational components of the agency. And for some people in the DO, that just doesn't set very well. Has it been successful? I think, from my standpoint, it's a mixed picture. And sometimes it depends, again, on leadership. Sometimes it depends on the particular mission centers. I think some have been better at integration and collaboration than others. I think that's pretty well accepted inside the agency. The collaboration, however, I think is important because I can speak to that from personal terms. Back when I worked on the Iraq issue in the mid-1990s, this was at a time when compartmentation was still almost a religion inside the agency. And unless you were one of the anointed analysts who had access to special operational information, particularly covert action, you were somewhat out there in left field when you're trying to do your analysis. It was particularly troublesome as a leadership analyst because in the 90s, we're trying to get rid of Saddam. I'm the senior Iraq leadership analyst, and I'm not clued into the covert program. So I don't know really who we're trying to push up and who we're trying to push down. And I was never cleared for any of that. And that was one of my professional frustrations that led me to join the history staff. That's a lot different now. Many analysts are read into covert action programs or working closely with sensitive operational activities. That's all to the good. And I think when you combine that with the technologists in the Directorate of Science and Technology, the support people in the Directorate of Support, and the digital wizards in the Digital Innovation Directorate, I think that's going to be a plus. But it's still taking a while to work out. We've also had some shifts in the mission center construct as issues rise and fall. For a while, we had a Korea mission center when North Korea was such a hot issue during the first Trump administration. Then that died off, and the Korean activities were moved back into the East Asia Pacific Mission Center, out of which then grew the China Mission Center, because now China is the preeminent issue at the agency, along with counter narcotics and Russia still, of course, North Korea still, of course, terrorism still, of course, but China is now the big issue that's captivating a lot of attention there, and possibly the modernization construct gives us a little more bureaucratic flexibility than we would have had with simply the directorate stovepipes. Last point I want to make is now that the wars are over, thankfully, the agency is having to relearn some things that it had forgotten during the prior decades of fighting terrorism and being preoccupied in Iraq and Afghanistan. In other words, if you are a case officer working in a war zone, meeting up with assets is very difficult, obviously, but you also do it in unconventional ways. You get into an armored vehicle, drive out of the green zone, meet the asset with a security cordon around you, and then go back into the green zone and the safety of the embassy grounds. Well, that's not the way that conventional espionage tradecraft is handled. When you think back into the Cold War period, that's not streetcraft as the old timers knew it, or even the not so old timers. So we have all these new case officers who had to work in war zones. It was almost obligatory that you took an assignment in a war zone. You either did it for career purposes or patriotic reasons or whatever. But operationally, it's very different than working in Moscow or Beijing or some third country that's not in a war zone. So we're having to relearn conventional tradecraft, which is all the more difficult in the era of ubiquitous technical surveillance. And again, I can't get into the details about it. Thankfully, the history staff has been able to leaven some of the discussion by looking back on older forms of operational activity and seeing ways in which they can be applied to UTS environments. Some people have argued that we always had UTS. It just wasn't big on, it wasn't the T. It was ubiquitous people surveillance. Block watchers, grannies with brooms in Moscow, people in shopping centers. Just name the country and you know that you had watchers watching you all the time. But now you're having to worry about cameras and other sophisticated devices that are watching your tradecraft. And then, of course, all the issues with cell phones and the internet and so forth. Some of it is an issue with the current generation being so caught up in technology fads that they just can't get away from the fact that, my cell phone or my laptop is the only way to go. It's the secure way to go. Well, it's anything but, as we all know. So relearning that tradecraft, learning some of the old school techniques, methods of deception, watching here while I'm doing something over here, like a magician. Lots of ways to try to get around that. And so we'll have to relearn that to be more effective against the current hard targets, which are extremely formidable. All right, that was a not so quick run through of 50 years. I'd be certainly interested in maybe a little bit of feedback about things you wished I'd talk about. If you had set up your own list of highlights and lowlights, for the past half century. That would be interesting for you to pass on to Jim. Maybe we could have a further discussion in some other fashion. But anyway, thanks very much for listening. I appreciate the opportunity to take this look back at some of the major events in AFIO's half century. Thank you.
That brings back a lot of memories. Your 50-year history covered all of my 35-year career. So lots of things that you touched on are things that I was involved in, at least indirectly. I will say on retraining, I joined the agency and went through training in 1971-72. And I will say that we actually had a large number of paramilitary officers rotating back from Southeast Asia. And they were actually put through the farm again to become more conventional case officers. And literally, when I went through ops training, it was my CT class, but an equal number of paramilitary officers that had just returned from Southeast Asia to be retread as conventional case officers. So we haven't indeed done this in the past. We can figure out how to do it again, I think. Clearly, the technology will be a challenge, but we're capable of doing that kind of thing.
Yeah, it'd be good if we could find some kind of reliable records, comprehensive records about what that training was. We've tried to investigate elements of our training practices in the past, and it's been a little bit difficult because of record keeping, and a lot of the training, of course, is, if you will, off the books. It's done face-to-face, it's done ad hoc. It's not a syllabus. It's not necessarily a rigid curriculum. So little hard to recreate it, but it would be useful.
And of course, all of these were paper files.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank David. Fantastic review. I think it's very, very appropriate for us in this, our 50th anniversary year. And I'm delighted that we will have the chance to distribute this to a much broader audience. So, David, thanks very much.
Thank you, Jim. Bye, everyone.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.com.